Hello, my name is Bernd Stahl. I am the director of the Center for Computing and Social Responsibility, which is one of the research centers in the informatics department in the Faculty of Technology. I will talk today about human research ethics in the Faculty of Technology. That's partly because I'm also chair of the Faculty Human Research Ethics Committee. This talk is meant for all undergraduate students who are doing research projects. It's equally relevant to MSc students doing research projects. It is applicable to PhD students to some degree, as well as members of staff, because there's some similarity in the way all of these different groups have to address human research ethics. Before I start talking about the specific topic of human research ethics, I will briefly say a few things about some of the background. When you do research ethics, when you fill in your forms, when you go through the procedures that are required, you may wonder why you're supposed to do this. So it's worthwhile thinking for a second about what is ethics and what's it got to do with what I'm doing and why should I be interested. The first thing we might want to ask ourselves is, what is ethics? Why is ethics relevant to research? And what has it got to do with the research project that I'm undertaking? Well, the history of ethics is a very long one. One very simple attempt to define it would be ethics has to do with the question of what's right versus what's wrong, what should we do, what shouldn't we do, good versus bad. But ethics is also a lot more than that. Ethics has to do with questions of practical guidance of actual decisions and actions. But more importantly, from an academic perspective, ethics has to do with questions of justification of right and wrong. So it's not just about telling you this is right and this is wrong, this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do, but it is about thinking about why is something right, why do we consider something wrong, what are the theoretical and the principles behind it, behind the justifications of good and bad. Ethics, as a general question, as the question of good and bad, is as old as humanity, and as an academic discipline, it's as old as philosophy. So it's at least 2,500 years old. It goes back to the Greek antiquity. It has a lot to do with other disciplines, academic as well as other fields of practice. So ethics has something to do with intuition. We mostly think we know what's right or wrong in most situations. It has something to do with ethical theories, and we'll very briefly touch on some of them. It has something to do with the general worldview, which is often wrapped up with questions of religion. Now, I don't have the time to say a lot of detail or give you a lot of detail about ethics, but I think it's important for you to understand what ethics is in order to understand what the role of ethics in research is. If you think about why somebody is doing research, and that includes you as a student or as a member of staff, then I think it's important to consider that in most cases this has some sort of ethical motivation. So we do research because we think it's a good thing. Now, we may vary in vastly different ways as to what we think is good and why we think something is good, but generally we do research because the outcome of the research is important, we feel that the process of doing research is important, and that it promotes some moral or other good. Whether that is something very clearly tangible, so we do research because we want to achieve a particular goal, because we want to have a job, because we want to have a certain degree, because we want to make money for a company, or whether we do blue skies research just for the pure knowledge of it, there always is something behind it where we say, well, this is a good thing. So ethics and research, I would argue, are very closely related in principle. In addition, the products of research can be ethically relevant. So the products of research can be positive or negative. And in most cases, research will have some sort of practical outcomes, and those practical outcomes will change the way people live their lives. And that may be for the better or the worse. There are a lot of ethical issues surrounding the conduct of research. So as a researcher, you can do certain things which are considered right or wrong. And the obvious examples that all students should be aware of are issues around authorship, intellectual property, plagiarism. Now, every student should know that they're not supposed to plagiarize, and partly because that's considered a bad thing for a variety of different reasons. Other issues to do with the conduct of research are in the correctness of data, in the fabrication, which is one of the primary academic sins, in questions of negligence. So these are all things to do with the conduct of research which touch on ethical issues. And finally, there is the process of research having to do with the conduct. How do we do research? What are the processes within the research that will allow us to achieve ethically good outcomes? And this is where human research ethics in the direct sense of the term comes in. Human research ethics, as I will talk about it, has to do with the treatment of human beings as sources of information and data. That's the primary interest of human research ethics. So, as you can see, it only covers a relatively small aspect of the overall area of ethics and research. When is human research ethics relevant to you, to research in DMU? Well, according to the DMU guidelines, there are several clear indications of research being ethically relevant. And the first one is, and that's probably the most applicable, most widely used one, is that when somebody gathers information from human beings for their research, this may be through, for example, interviews, through questionnaires, through observation of human behavior. If any of those happen, then it is likely, well, you will have to interact with human beings, and it's likely that that will have potential ethical consequences. And it's easy to imagine many of those. So if you, for example, interview somebody, you may find something out about them that they do not want to be or don't want to see published. If you do a survey, you may find patterns of behavior which are problematic. So in principle, there are possible ethical issues that need to be thought about. The second possibility of human research ethics being relevant to research is where no direct data is collected from human beings, but where data is used, which was compiled at an earlier stage, and where that data may be linked to identifiable human beings. So this is where you use archival data, where you may use weblogs, chat rooms, anything where there is data that already exists, but which may be linked to human beings. The third point is where research is linked to illegal behavior, or where activities which are either illegal or maybe risky, dangerous. So this is the case where the observation of human behavior may reveal that they are engaged in illegal activities, or where the conduct of the research may lead to harm or injury of the respondents. And the fourth point you see here is or refers to research which may lead to innovation that changes the way humans act. So that's sort of a catch-all for any sort of research which will have tangible outputs and consequences which are reasonably clear in advance. And again, if you do research, in most cases you're thinking about what research you're doing, why you're doing it, and what the consequences of this are. And therefore you should have some sort of idea of what the consequences will be and what possible ethical issues might be. Now, all of these are general regulations, and they are important for everybody to think about. In addition, it's important to call your attention to research which involves human tissue. Any such research falls under a different regulation, and I'm not going to touch this here in any depth, but if you do any sort of research that uses human tissue, then you have to contact your Human Research Ethics Committee. If you're in the Faculty of Technology, that would be me immediately. What are the principles of human research ethics? The principle is, as indicated earlier, that everybody doing research within the Montfort University has to undergo ethics review. And that includes undergraduate students doing a research project, that includes master's students, it includes research students, as well as postgraduates, postdoctoral students, and members of staff. The first activity that has to be undertaken is for the researcher to fill in a research ethics review form. This is currently available from the Faculty and University Human Research Ethics Committee websites. In the future, it is likely to be available online, but the principles are going to remain the same, so whatever I say will stay the same. So the researcher fills in the form, and I'll come back to what exactly needs to be in this form in a minute. Then the supervisor, or depending on the nature of the researcher, it may be the line manager, has to authorize this form. So it has to be signed by the first supervisor for undergraduate students, for PhD students, and it has to be signed by the line manager for members of staff. It then, depending on the nature of the researcher, will either go to the Human Research Ethics Committee, or it will be assessed by the supervisor and the second supervisor. In either case, there are 4 different possible outcomes of the review. And the 4 different outcomes you can see here is, first, it might be that there is no ethical issue. This can only be the case if no human being is involved in undertaking the research. If there's any involvement of human respondents in the research, there will always be ethical issues that need to be addressed, so it can't be a 1. Then the majority of cases are the next point. It's the outcome number 2, where there are minor ethical issues which have been addressed. So that's typically the case when you want to do interviews, when you do surveys, when you do any sort of research with rational adults who are aware of what's happening. Outcome number 3 is where there are major ethical issues which have also been addressed, where the concerns have been resolved. And this is typically the case where the research involves vulnerable people, where it involves children, where it involves patients in hospitals and so on. And number 4, the outcome is if there are ethical issues which haven't been resolved. If the outcome is number 4, that means you're not allowed to do the research has to stop, you're not allowed to collect the data until you have resolved the issues. The form that documents this, the Human Research Ethics Approval Form, should in some way accompany the research. So if we're talking about final year projects, then the normal expectation would be that the form finds its way as an appendix into the final submission of the dissertation. The different types of researchers in DMU have slightly different pathways, as I've already indicated. Everybody has to do the first step, so everybody has to fill in the form. Then for taught students, so that's final year undergraduates normally, or master's students, it's the first and the second supervisor of the particular project that do the ethics review. If they are satisfied that the outcome is a 1 or 2, so that's either no ethical issues or minor ethical issues which have been resolved, then the project coordinator collects the data about this. The form goes into the appendix of the dissertation, and that's where it stops. If it's a number 3 or number 4, then the whole application and all supplementing documentation has to be submitted to the Faculty Human Research Ethics Committee. For all PhD students, for research students, as well as members of staff, all projects go to the Faculty Human Research Ethics Committee, where the decision is going to be made whether it's 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. It's important to reiterate that this is a university requirement. This is not something that's discretionary. Everybody has to do it. If you don't do it, if you're undertaking research and you're not going through ethics review, then you're violating DMU regulations. The content of the form is relatively easy. I'll start that again. The content of the form is as shown on this slide. It contains a lot of information that the researcher will have at their fingertips anyway. So in addition to some information about the student name, the program, and the title of the project, a brief description of the project, the researcher needs to identify what the ethical issues are and how they are addressed. Those are the 2 main bits that need to be done. So an ethical issue might be questions of informed consent because of undertaking a survey or doing an interview. The way those may be addressed might be something like production of an informed consent form, collection of consent letters, the indication of consent within a survey, whatever it may be. Then you're going to be asked what codes of conduct you've referred to. This is something which is very important for courses where there is a strong professional aspect to it. So, for example, in nursing. In the Faculty of Technology, a lot of the programs are not professionally accredited or are not as directly dependent on professional accreditation. So you need to think about which professional code of conduct would be most suitable for you. And there's a list of potential ones on the Faculty Ethics website. Typical examples for appropriate conducts in computing would be the British Computer Society or the Association for Computing Machinery Codes of Conduct. If you have any queries about this, how to fill in the form, the first port of call should be your supervisor, should be the first person who is going to sign the form in addition to you. If the supervisor can't answer the question, then the question can be escalated to the Faculty Human Research Ethics Committee, and then the supervisor can contact me or another member of the committee. The requirements to get ethics approval are detailed on the form, and I'll briefly go through them now. The first one and the most fundamental one is that the respondent has to give informed consent to being the respondent to the data they provide being used in the way intended in the research. That means in the first instance, the participation of the respondent in the research has to be voluntary. Voluntary means that they need to understand what's happening and they need to consent to it. So this is the principle, the most important principle of human research ethics, and it's very similar to ethical aspects that you find in medicine. Whenever somebody undertakes procedure on a patient, the patient needs to understand it and the patient needs to consent to that. And that's the same here. Secondly, we should aim for anonymity of the respondents. So in the majority of cases, you will not need to know the exact detail of who said what. What's important is that somebody said something, or that a certain group of the population believes something. So in most cases, it will not be a requirement, not a scientific requirement for you to be able to pinpoint who exactly said what. Therefore, it is advisable to anonymize whatever data you collect. That means that the respondent needs to understand that whatever they say will be treated anonymously, and it also means that they need to understand how this is going to happen. In some cases, this may not be possible. In those cases, you need to make sure that the respondents are very clear about it and explicitly consent to this. Furthermore, it is important that the data you collect for the research purposes is not going to be used for any other research purposes. So if you think you want to use data for some other additional purpose, you need to make this very clear at the beginning. You can't collect data on something and then use it for a different purpose. Okay, the third principle is that nobody must be harmed or adversely affected because of the research. So whatever research you do, you need to make sure that you think about what are the consequences for the respondents that can arise from the research. So this means, or it can refer to issues of confidentiality, which is what I've just talked about, the questions of anonymity. So you have to make sure that nobody will get into any trouble because of whatever they said to you during the research. It also refers to any sort of research which may physically harm, or in any other way harm your respondent. So if you test a piece of electronic equipment, for example, you have to make sure that there's no danger of injury because of the research. The fourth point here is that one area of the population which is frequently researched within the Faculty of Technology, but which raises particular problems, is that of children and young people. The reason for that is that children and young people may not understand what exactly it is the research is about. So they find it hard to consent to it because their understanding of the word and of research is not sufficient for them to be able to give their informed consent. At the same time, of course, children and research are in many cases interesting areas of research. So you may want to find out how children react to an e-teaching environment. If you want to work with children, then the principle is that you need to get the informed consent from both the children and the parents or carers. And you need to think very carefully about how you can do that. So you need to provide the children with information about the research, which is understandable for the children at that age group. So if you want to involve children who are 8, you will have to write different information from children who are 14. And that is something that you need to think about prior to doing the research, and that you need to think about with regards to gaining their informed consent. But it's not enough to just gain the children's consent. You will normally also have to have the parents or carers' consent, and then you have to think about whatever way possible for you to collect the data without raising further issues. For example, a typical way of doing that would be to have a teacher with you in the room if you do research in schools. These are detailed issues that you need to think about as you go along, but it's something that you need to be aware of. If you involve children, then it's going to be a major ethical issue. The outcome is going to be 3, and you need to be sure that it's going to go through ethics scrutiny. If you use recording techniques or recording equipment, then it's important, again, that the people you are recording understand that. If you want to do an interview and you want to tape record that, then a good piece of practice would be to have a specific line on your consent form saying, I understand that my interview is going to be recorded, and for the people to sign this off. You certainly do not want to record anybody without their knowledge. And finally, it has to be possible for the people who you are doing your research on to ascertain your identity. So you have to have some sort of ID, normally your student card, that shows that you are who you are and that allows them to ascertain that the research is genuine. When you submit the ethics review form, then there is a set of documentation which should accompany it. The ethics review form is assessed, if it goes to the ethics committee, by somebody who may not know what your research is about. So it is important that the documentation that you submit allows people to understand what you're trying to do, why you're doing it, and how this fits with the ethics requirement. So first of all, the form needs to be accompanied by a document that explains what the research is. So in the case of undergraduate projects, that tends to be the terms of reference. For PhD students, that tends to be the registration form. For members of staff, it would be the research proposal. Secondly, you have to give detail on all the arrangements for participation of human subjects and how you're going to collect consent and how you're going to ensure confidentiality. In most cases, this will be a participant information sheet, a piece of paper where you explain what the research is about, as well as a consent form where the participants can sign that they've understood what the project is about and that they're happy for it to go ahead. If there is anything else you provide in terms of information to the participants, that also needs to be submitted with the ethics review form. In some cases, you may have or you may require ethics permission from other sources. So, for example, if you want to work with patients, you will need permission from the National Health Service. If you have ethics permission from them, this would be part of the submission. And then, in rare cases for the Faculty of Technology, you may want to include a list of drugs and so on. Finally, in cases where this is appropriate, you have to submit some sort of description of your ability to undertake the research. So your competence to do whatever you say you're doing needs to be given. If you're just doing things like interviews or questionnaires, that's not normally required, but if you're doing some specialist activities, then that would be something that's needed. Okay, this brings me to the end of the talk. The idea of the talk, just to recap, was to give you an idea of what human research ethics is about what you need to do in order to comply with human research ethics, and to make sure that you understand the basic principles. I want to repeat that the idea of human research ethics is not to stop you doing your research. There may be cases where we may tell you not to do your research, but those are the absolute minority. The most important point of going through ethics review is to make sure that the research is ethically acceptable and that it has good outcomes. So it is meant as a supportive process that helps you to improve the quality of your research. Therefore, you should see it in this positive light, and you should see going through ethics review as part of doing research. So it's part of your training as an academic to understand that whenever you do research, when you collect information on human beings, then you have to think about what are the ethical issues. Thank you.